Hello there, my dear friend. Come, sit with me for a while. Tonight, I want to share something with you that the ancient Stoics understood profoundly, something that has sustained humanity through its darkest hours and most challenging moments. Pain, my friend. It's something we all know intimately. Loss, disappointment, failure, rejection, illness, heartbreak. These are not optional experiences in the human journey. They come to all of us, rich and poor, young and old, regardless of how carefully we plan or how wisely we live. But here's what the wise ones discovered thousands of years ago, and what modern science is only now beginning to understand. Pain is not our enemy. It is our teacher. It is our guide. It is the forge in which our character is shaped and our wisdom is refined. The great Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who had been born into slavery and knew suffering intimately, wrote, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And what did he mean by that? He meant that true wisdom comes not from avoiding pain, but from learning what it has to teach us. He meant that the storms of life, while they may break some people, can also transform them into something stronger, wiser, more compassionate. Tonight, I want to tell you about 3 souls who discovered this truth in the most challenging circumstances, about people who could have been broken by their experiences, but instead chose to be forged by them, about individuals who transformed their deepest wounds into their greatest sources of strength. So settle in now. Let your body sink deep into comfort. Let your breathing slow and deepen. And let me tell you about a scholar who lost everything and discovered that losing can be a kind of finding, about an artist whose greatest work came from his darkest hour, and about a mother who discovered that sometimes what breaks us open is exactly what sets us free. 3 stories, 3 souls, 3 lessons about how pain can become power, how wounds can become wisdom, and how the most difficult chapters of our lives can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. Close your eyes now and listen to these tales of transformation, of courage, and of the indomitable human spirit that can turn even the deepest suffering into the most profound strength. The scholar who lost everything. The year was 70 AD, and the flames that consumed Jerusalem painted the sky crimson with a light that could be seen for miles across the desert. In the ancient city, where stone buildings had stood for centuries, where the Temple of Solomon had risen as a monument to divine glory, now only ashes remained. The Roman legions under General Titus had laid waste to everything, leaving behind a landscape that resembled a graveyard of civilization itself. Among the survivors who fled the destruction was a man named Joseph ben Mattathias, though history would know him by the name he would later choose, Josephus. He was a scholar of 30 years, a man who had devoted his life to studying philosophy, history, and the sacred writings of his people. His mind was sharp, his knowledge extensive, his reputation among the learned men of Jerusalem respected and envied. But now, as he walked among the ruins of his beloved city, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the memories that burned in his heart, Josephus was confronted with a reality that would transform not just his circumstances, but his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Josephus had been in Jerusalem during the siege. He had watched friends die of starvation while Roman soldiers gorged themselves on the spoils of war. He had seen children starve while their parents clutched desperately to jewelry and gold that could have bought food. He had witnessed scholars like himself argue about philosophy while the city burned around them, debating theoretical points while practical survival demands went unmet. Most devastating of all, he had witnessed the complete collapse of everything he had believed about his people, his culture, and his calling as a scholar. The intellectual elite, of which he had been a proud member, had proven themselves incapable of practical wisdom when it was needed most. They had been so focused on abstract theories and theological debates that they had failed to prevent the destruction of their entire civilization. As Josephus walked through the wasteland that had once been his home, he felt the weight of his own uselessness pressing down upon him like a physical burden. All his learning, all his knowledge, all his reputation, what had it accomplished? When people needed practical help, he had offered philosophical abstractions. When lives hung in the balance, he had provided historical analysis. When wisdom was needed, he had delivered scholarly commentary. The irony was not lost on him. He who had spent years studying the great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, the Stoics and the Epicureans, had failed to apply their most fundamental teachings to his own life. He had read about virtue, but had not practiced it when it mattered. He had studied wisdom, but had not recognized it when faced with practical challenges. As he continued his wandering, Josephus encountered other survivors, people who had lost everything but who possessed something he had not developed during his years of scholarly pursuits: the ability to adapt, to improvise, to find practical solutions to immediate problems. He met a carpenter who was already fashioning simple tools from the debris of destroyed buildings. He encountered a baker who was planning how to feed families using whatever grain could be salvaged from the ruins. He found farmers who were already plotting how to restore the land to productivity. These people, who had no formal education, who had spent their lives working with their hands rather than their minds, were demonstrating a kind of intelligence that Josephus's academic training had failed to provide. They were showing resilience, creativity, and practical wisdom that made his theoretical knowledge seem like a collection of beautiful but useless decorations. The transformation of Josephus's understanding began one evening when he shared bread with a group of survivors around a small fire. Among them was an old woman named Miriam, whose face was lined with the kind of hardship that only a life of struggle can create. She had lost her husband, her children, and her home in the destruction of Jerusalem. Yet somehow she possessed a peace and contentment that Josephus, despite all his learning, could not achieve. "How do you bear it?" Josephus asked her as they sat together under the star-filled sky. "How do you find any meaning in what has happened to us?" Miriam looked at him with eyes that held depths of suffering and understanding. "Young scholar," she said gently, "I have been thinking about this same question, and I've realized something that perhaps your books have not taught you." She gestured toward the ruins, visible in the distance. All of this, the temple, the palaces, the houses, the walls, it was all temporary. It was all going to pass away anyway. Whether the Romans destroyed it or time wore it down or earthquakes reduced it to rubble. But something else survived the destruction. Josephus leaned forward, intrigued despite his grief. "What survived?" "People like me," Miriam said with a slight smile. "People like the carpenter, like the baker, like the farmer. We survived because we knew something that perhaps you scholars had forgotten. We knew that the most important things, love, kindness, the ability to care for each other, the skill to make something from nothing, these are not destroyed by fire. They are only destroyed when we choose to let them die." She paused, looking into the fire that danced between them. "The Romans burned our buildings, but they cannot burn our memories. They can destroy our books, but they cannot destroy our ability to learn from what we have experienced. They can scatter our people, but they cannot scatter the wisdom that comes from surviving together." Her words began to shift something in Josephus's understanding. But what of learning? What of knowledge? What of the great ideas that have sustained our people for centuries? "Ah," Miriam said, "you are thinking like a scholar, but perhaps it's time to think like a human being. What good is knowledge that cannot be applied? What value is learning that cannot be shared? What use is wisdom that cannot be lived?" She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks floating up into the night sky like tiny stars. "Your great philosophers, the ones you have studied so carefully, what were they really teaching you? They were teaching you how to live well, were they not? How to be brave when facing difficulties. How to be kind when others are cruel. How to be wise when facing confusion. But you have been so busy learning about these things that you have forgotten to practice them." As the night wore on, and as the group of survivors shared their stories and their meager possessions, Josephus began to experience something he had never felt during his years of academic study. The satisfaction that comes from practical wisdom being applied to real needs. He found himself helping to organize the distribution of food, contributing ideas about where to find water, offering suggestions about how to protect the group from danger. For the first time in his life, his knowledge was being tested against immediate practical demands. His understanding of philosophy was being applied to questions of survival and cooperation. His study of history was being used to avoid mistakes that had been made by others in similar circumstances. And something remarkable began to happen. The more Josephus engaged with these immediate practical challenges, the more his understanding of his previous studies deepened and became more meaningful. The abstract concepts he had learned from books suddenly came alive when he saw them demonstrated in the actions of people like Miriam, who possessed practical wisdom despite having no formal education. Over the following weeks and months, as Josephus traveled with various groups of survivors, he began to document not just the destruction he had witnessed, but the resilience he was observing. He interviewed people about how they had survived, how they had adapted to change, how they had maintained hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. What he discovered and what he began to write about was that the most valuable knowledge was not the theoretical learning he had acquired in his youth, but the practical wisdom that ordinary people demonstrated when facing extraordinary circumstances. These survivors, many of whom had never read a philosophical text, were living out the principles that the great thinkers had only theorized about. They were demonstrating courage in the face of loss, resilience in the face of adversity, and wisdom in the face of uncertainty. They were showing that the Stoic principles of accepting what cannot be changed while focusing on what can be controlled were not just intellectual exercises, but practical tools for living well in any circumstances. Years later, when Josephus had established himself as a historian and chronicler of the events he had witnessed, he would write about his transformation from scholar to witness. He would describe how losing everything he had valued, his home, his reputation, his position in society, had taught him something that all his years of study had failed to teach him: the difference between knowledge and wisdom. In his writings, he would argue that true learning occurs not when we accumulate information, but when we apply what we have learned to the challenges of actual living. He would maintain that the greatest scholars are not those who can recite the most philosophical texts, but those who can translate abstract principles into practical guidance for people facing real difficulties. But perhaps his most profound insight, the one that would echo through the centuries, was his understanding that loss can be a kind of liberation. By losing his attachment to his previous life as a respected scholar, he had been freed to discover what he was truly capable of becoming. By being stripped of all his external markers of success, he had been forced to discover what lay at the core of his character. In his later years, when he was celebrated as one of the great historians of his time, Josephus would often speak about how his greatest achievement had not been his writings about the Jewish war, but his discovery of how to live with meaning even when everything he had valued had been taken from him. He would explain to younger scholars that pain, loss, and failure are not obstacles to overcome, but opportunities to discover what we are truly made of. He would maintain that the most profound education comes not from books, but from experience, not from avoiding difficulties, but from learning what they have to teach us. And he would always end such discussions by sharing what he had learned from Miriam and the other survivors. That wisdom is not about having answers to every question, but about developing the courage and resilience to face whatever questions life may present. He would explain that the greatest scholars are not those who have learned the most, but those who have learned how to learn from every experience, even the most painful ones. Now, the artist who found his masterpiece in darkness. The year was 1889, and the narrow streets of Montmartre in Paris held their breath as winter's chill settled over the city like a shroud. In a small room at the top of a crumbling building on Rue de l'Aveugle, the street of the blind, lived a young artist whose name would one day be spoken with reverence throughout the world of art. But in this winter of 1889, Vincent van Gogh was a man on the brink of complete despair. Vincent was 36 years old, though he looked older. His face, weathered by exposure and marked by the strain of his mental anguish, carried the expression of someone who had stared too long into the abyss of human suffering. His hair, once thick and dark, had begun to thin, and his beard, which he wore untrimmed, gave him the appearance of a hermit who had long ago abandoned society's conventions. He had been living in Paris for 2 years, following his brother Theo, who worked at the art dealership Goupil and C. But despite Theo's connections and Vincent's genuine passion for art, his paintings were not selling. Critics called them crude, primitive, lacking in technical skill. Other artists dismissed his bold use of color and his unconventional brushwork. The dealers showed no interest in his work. The public remained indifferent. To make matters worse, Vincent had been struggling with mental illness for most of his adult life. what modern medicine would recognize as depression and anxiety disorders, Vincent experienced as overwhelming waves of despair, periods of mania followed by crushing lows, and episodes where the boundary between reality and hallucination became dangerously thin. The winter of 1889 had been particularly harsh. Vincent had moved to Montmartre to save money, but the isolation and poverty were taking their toll. He had no money for proper food, no fuel to heat his small room, no friends to provide comfort or encouragement. The few artists he had encountered in Paris had either ignored him or treated him with barely concealed disdain. Most devastating of all, he had begun to doubt whether he was truly an artist at all. His paintings, which he had once believed held deep emotional truth and spiritual power, now seemed to him to be the desperate attempts of a failed human being to find meaning in his suffering. He questioned whether his vision was genuine or simply the product of a disturbed mind. One evening in January, as snow fell outside his window and the temperature in his room dropped toward freezing, Vincent sat before a small oil lamp, staring at a blank canvas that had been provided by Theo. The canvas was expensive, more than Vincent could afford on his own, and he felt the weight of responsibility to create something worthy of the gift. But his mind was empty. He had no subjects to paint, no inspiration to draw from, no vision to express. The only thing he could see clearly was his own failure, his own inadequacy, his own worthlessness as both an artist and a human being. As he sat there in the dim light, a strange thing began to happen. Instead of fighting against his despair, instead of trying to push away his negative thoughts, Vincent found himself observing them with the same attention he might have given to a landscape he was painting. He began to notice the texture of his suffering, the way his thoughts moved like clouds across his mind, the way his emotions had colors and shapes and movements that could be translated into visual form. Perhaps, he said aloud to the empty room, this is what I am meant to paint. Not pretty scenes or beautiful people, but the truth of what it feels like to be human. Not the surface of things, but their essence. Not what the eye sees, but what the heart knows. For the first time in months, Vincent felt a spark of something that might have been hope. He had spent years trying to paint what he thought art should be. Classical subjects, technically proficient compositions, beautiful scenes that would appeal to the tastes of the Parisian art establishment. But perhaps what the world needed was not more beautiful paintings, but honest ones. Perhaps what people needed was not art that distracted them from their troubles, but art that acknowledged them and transformed them into something meaningful. With trembling hands, Vincent began to paint. He didn't use a brush in the conventional way. Instead, he used a palette knife, applying thick layers of paint directly to the canvas, working with an intensity and passion that he had never experienced before. The painting that emerged was unlike anything he had ever created. He called it The Starry Night, though he had painted it not from observation of the sky, but from his memory of looking out his window during one of his most difficult episodes. The swirling patterns in the sky were not based on astronomical accuracy, but on the way his troubled mind had perceived the movement of light and energy across the heavens. The painting was wild, turbulent, filled with movement and emotion. The cypress tree in the foreground reached toward the sky like a flame, its dark branches contrasting with the bright spirals of the star-filled heavens. The village below was rendered in simple, almost childlike forms, as if viewed through the eyes of someone who had stepped outside himself to observe the world with wonder. As Vincent worked, he felt something transformative happening within him. The very act of painting his despair was somehow transmuting it into something beautiful. The colors he used, deep blues, brilliant yellows, vivid greens, seemed to have a life of their own, creating harmony and balance even as they expressed chaos and confusion. Hours passed without Vincent's awareness. He was completely absorbed in the process of creation, something he had never experienced before. Previous paintings had been laborious efforts, requiring him to concentrate on technique and composition. But this painting seemed to paint itself, with Vincent serving as a conduit for something larger than his conscious mind. When he finally set down his palette knife and stepped back from the canvas, he was amazed by what he had created. This was not the work of a failed artist or a disturbed mind. This was the work of someone who had touched something profound about the nature of existence itself. The painting seemed to pulse with life. The stars were not distant points of light, but living beings, spinning and dancing in patterns that spoke of infinite energy and creativity. The cypress tree was not merely a plant, but a symbol of endurance, rooted in earth while reaching toward the infinite sky. The village was not just a collection of buildings, but a representation of human community, peaceful and stable despite the cosmic turmoil above. Vincent stared at his work with wonder and amazement. This painting had come from the same place within him that had produced his darkest thoughts and most overwhelming fears. But somehow, through the process of creation, his suffering had been transformed into beauty, his despair into hope, his pain into power. In the days that followed, Vincent continued to paint with this new understanding of his artistic purpose. He realized that his mental illness was not a curse that prevented him from being a real artist, but a unique perspective that allowed him to see and express truths that others might miss. His episodes of depression and mania were not obstacles to overcome, but sources of inspiration to channel. He began to paint portraits of the people in his neighborhood, not idealized versions, but honest representations that captured both the beauty and the struggle of ordinary lives. He painted still lifes that revealed the spiritual essence of everyday objects. He created landscapes that expressed the emotional landscape of the human soul. Most importantly, he began to understand that his suffering was not meaningless, but was in fact the very source of his artistic power. Without his experience of pain, without his encounters with despair and confusion, without his struggles with mental illness, he would never have been able to create work that spoke to the deepest experiences of human existence. As spring arrived in Paris, Vincent's paintings began to change in character. They became more vibrant, more hopeful, more filled with life and energy. But they retained the emotional depth and spiritual intensity that had first emerged in the starry night. He had learned to use his pain not as something to overcome, but as something to transform. Months later, when Theo visited and saw his brother's latest work, he was amazed by the transformation he observed. Vincent's paintings had not only improved technically, but had gained something that could not be taught or learned through conventional means. They had gained a soul. "Vincent," Theo said as he examined a series of flower paintings, "these are not just paintings. They are prayers. They are meditations. They are expressions of something sacred." Vincent nodded, understanding what his brother meant. Through his art, he had learned to commune with something larger than himself, to tap into a source of creativity and meaning that had been present within him all along, but had remained undiscovered until he stopped fighting against his pain and started learning from it. Years later, long after Vincent's death, when the Starry Night had become one of the most famous paintings in the world, art historians would struggle to understand how someone who had been considered a failure during his lifetime had created work of such enduring power and beauty. But Vincent himself had already discovered the secret. In a letter to his brother, he had written, "I am not a madman, as some would have it. I am simply someone who has learned to see differently, to feel more deeply, to transform what others might call suffering into something that can heal and inspire." He had learned that the most profound art comes not from avoiding difficult emotions, but from diving deep into them and discovering what lies beneath. He had discovered that creativity is not the opposite of pain, but its transformation. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that what we consider our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths when we stop seeing them as obstacles to overcome and start seeing them as sources of power to embrace. His mental illness had not made him a lesser artist, but a different kind of artist, one who could see and express truths that conventional approaches might miss. Now, my friend, let's talk about the mother who discovered strength through brokenness. The year was 2008, and Hurricane Ike was bearing down on the Gulf Coast like a force of nature that had been specifically designed to test the limits of human endurance. In the small coastal town of Galveston, Texas, where generations of families had weathered countless storms, the residents were making their final preparations for what meteorologists were calling the storm of the century. Among them was Maria Santos, a 42-year-old mother of three, whose life had already been shaped by enough challenges to last several lifetimes. Maria was a woman of Mexican heritage who had been raised in a poor farming community in South Texas, the daughter of immigrants who had worked as laborers in the fields from dawn to dusk, teaching their children that hard work and perseverance were the only reliable paths to a better life. Maria had married young to escape poverty, but her marriage had been troubled from the beginning. Her husband, Roberto, had struggled with alcoholism and had alternated between periods of employment and unemployment, between moments of tenderness and episodes of violence. For 15 years, Maria had lived with the constant uncertainty of never knowing which version of her husband would come home each evening. But despite these challenges, Maria had built something beautiful within the chaos of her circumstances. She had created a warm, welcoming home filled with love and laughter. She had raised her three children, Carlos, age 15, Sophia, age 12, and little Miguel, age 8, with a combination of fierce protectiveness and gentle nurturing that had given them a solid foundation despite their father's instability. Maria had worked multiple jobs as a housekeeper in the hotels that served Galveston's tourist trade, as a seamstress making alterations for the wealthy vacationers, as a Spanish interpreter for the local legal aid office, always managing to provide for her family while still being present for her children's school activities and emotional needs. She had learned to find joy in small moments, the sound of her children laughing as they played in the yard, the satisfaction of completing a difficult sewing project, the warmth of community with other mothers who understood the struggles of making ends meet while raising children alone. But Hurricane Ike changed everything. When the storm hit on September 13, 2008, it brought with it winds of 110 miles per hour and a storm surge that reached 15 feet in some areas. Maria had followed evacuation orders and taken her children to stay with her sister in Houston, but Roberto had refused to leave, claiming that the family needed to protect their home and belongings. As the storm raged and as Maria watched the news coverage from Houston, she felt helpless and terrified. The images from Galveston were apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods underwater, houses destroyed, the historic downtown district reduced to rubble. And through it all, there was no word from Roberto. When the storm had passed and when the evacuation orders were lifted, Maria returned to Galveston with her children to assess the damage to their home and their lives. What they found was devastating beyond anything they could have imagined. The house, which had been Maria's sanctuary and her children's childhood home, was completely destroyed. The storm surge had lifted the entire structure off its foundation and had carried it several blocks before depositing it in a twisted heap of debris and broken dreams. Everything Maria had worked for, the furniture she had carefully selected over the years, the children's clothes and toys, the family photos and keepsakes, the small savings she had managed to accumulate, all of it was gone. But worse than the loss of material possessions was the discovery that Roberto had not survived the storm. His body was found 3 days later, trapped in the debris of a neighbor's house where he had apparently sought shelter during the worst of the hurricane. He had been holding a family photo in his hands, as if he had died trying to protect what mattered most to him. For weeks after the funeral, Maria existed in a state of numbness. The magnitude of her loss was so complete that her mind seemed unable to process it all at once. She had lost her home, her husband, her sense of security, and her faith in the future. She had lost not just physical possessions, but memories, traditions, and the comfortable predictability of daily life. The weeks turned into months, and still Maria found herself unable to move forward. She and her children were staying with her sister, but the arrangement was temporary and increasingly strained. Her sister had her own family to support, and adding 3 more people to the household was causing financial and emotional stress that affected everyone. Maria found herself caught between 2 impossible choices: stay in Houston and depend on others for survival, or return to Galveston and try to rebuild their lives from scratch with no resources and no clear path forward. Neither option seemed viable, and the weight of making a decision while still grieving the loss of her husband and their entire way of life was almost unbearable. But Maria had always been a practical woman, someone who had learned to find solutions where others saw only problems. And in the depths of her despair, she began to realize that the hurricane, while it had taken everything she had built, had also given her something she had never possessed before: complete freedom to recreate her life according to her own values and vision. For the first time in her adult life, Maria was not constrained by someone else's problems or limitations. She did not have to work around Roberto's drinking or his moods or his tendency to make decisions based on pride rather than wisdom. She did not have to worry about protecting her children from their father's instability or trying to fix a marriage that could not be fixed. Instead, she found herself in the position of having to make decisions based solely on what she believed was best for her children and herself. She could choose where to live, how to make a living, what values to prioritize, and how to rebuild their lives according to principles that made sense to her, rather than according to the demands of circumstances beyond her control. As this realization settled in her mind, Mariah began to feel something she had not experienced in years: excitement about the future. It was excitement mixed with grief, hope mixed with uncertainty, but it was genuine nonetheless. For the first time since she was a young girl with dreams of a better life, Maria felt truly free to imagine what her life could become. The transformation began with small steps. Maria found work cleaning houses in Houston, but instead of viewing it as temporary employment, she began to see it as an opportunity to build a client base and develop skills that could eventually lead to her own cleaning business. She used her natural Spanish language skills to serve the growing Hispanic community in Houston, offering services that were tailored to the needs of families who were working multiple jobs and needed help with household tasks. Most importantly, she began to involve her children in these new ventures. Carlos, who was naturally good with numbers, helped her calculate costs and manage finances. Sophia, who had inherited her mother's creativity and attention to detail, assisted with organizing and decorating clients' homes. Even little Miguel contributed by creating simple crafts that could be sold to supplement their income. Through these collaborative efforts, Maria began to discover something she had never fully appreciated: the strength that comes from working together toward shared goals. In her marriage, she had often felt like she was carrying the burden of responsibility alone, trying to balance her husband's problems with her children's needs and her own dreams. But now, with her children as willing partners in rebuilding their lives, she found herself supported by people who shared her values and her commitment to creating a better future. As months turned into a year, and then into 2 years, Maria's cleaning business grew from a part-time effort to a full-time enterprise. She had saved enough money to rent a small house in Houston, and she had built a reputation in the Hispanic community as someone who could be trusted to provide reliable, high-quality service at fair prices. But the real transformation was not financial, but personal. Maria had discovered that she possessed capabilities and strengths that she had never been able to access while she was trapped in her previous circumstances. She had learned to make decisions quickly and confidently. She had developed skills in managing business finances, building relationships with clients, and organizing complex tasks efficiently. Most importantly, she had learned to trust herself. For years, she had second-guessed her own judgment, assuming that her perceptions were influenced by stress or emotional overwhelm. But now, faced with the need to make important decisions for her family's survival, she discovered that her instincts were usually correct and that she was far more capable than she had previously believed. The children also thrived in this new environment. Carlos developed an interest in business and eventually went to college to study entrepreneurship. Sophia discovered a passion for interior design and began helping Maria with more sophisticated decorating projects. Miguel, who had been traumatized by the loss of his father and their home, gradually emerged from his shell and began to excel in school, eventually becoming a teacher who specialized in helping children who had experienced trauma. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of their transformation was the relationship that developed between Maria and her children. In the old life, Roberto's problems had often created a dynamic where Maria had to focus her energy on managing crises and protecting her children from their father's instability. But in their new life, they were all working together as equal partners in creating their future. They held family meetings where everyone's opinions were valued and where decisions were made democratically. They celebrated their successes together and supported each other through their challenges. They developed traditions and rituals that honored both their Mexican heritage and their new American reality. Years later, when Maria was asked to speak at a women's conference about overcoming adversity, she would often begin by showing pictures of her destroyed house and her husband's grave. Then she would show pictures of her current home, a modest but beautiful house that she had bought with her own money, decorated with a creativity and attention to detail that had been her trademarks as a seamstress. I learned something powerful from losing everything, she would tell her audience. I learned that what we think are our greatest weaknesses, our struggles, our limitations, our experiences of pain and loss, can become our greatest strengths if we are willing to learn from them and use them to help others. She would explain that her experience of domestic violence had taught her to recognize warning signs and to help other women who were trapped in similar situations. Her experience of poverty had given her empathy and practical skills for helping other families who were struggling to make ends meet. Her experience of losing her home had taught her that security comes not from material possessions, but from the relationships and skills that cannot be taken away. And she would always end by sharing what she had learned from her children, that strength is not something you have or don't have, but something you develop through challenges that test your limits and expand your capacity. She would explain that her children had become strong, not despite their trauma, but because of it, because they had learned to support each other through difficulties and to find meaning in helping others who were facing similar challenges. I used to think that strength meant never falling down, she would conclude, but I learned that real strength means falling down and then helping others get back up. I learned that the most powerful thing you can do with your pain is to use it to help heal someone else's pain. And I learned that when you stop seeing your struggles as problems to be solved and start seeing them as gifts to be shared, everything changes. And so, my dear friend, we come to the end of our 3 tales of transformation. 3 stories about souls who discovered that what breaks us open is often exactly what sets us free. We met Josephus, the scholar who lost everything and discovered that losing can be a kind of finding. He learned that true wisdom comes not from avoiding pain, but from learning what it has to teach us. He discovered that the most valuable knowledge is not theoretical learning, but practical wisdom applied to real challenges. We met Vincent, the artist who found his masterpiece in darkness. He learned that what we consider our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths when we stop seeing them as obstacles and start seeing them as sources of power. He discovered that creativity is not the opposite of pain, but its transformation. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning. And we met Maria, the mother who discovered strength through brokenness. She learned that what we think are our greatest weaknesses, our struggles, our limitations, our experiences of pain and loss, can become our greatest strengths if we are willing to learn from them and use them to help others. 3 stories, 3 different times, 3 different kinds of pain, but the same timeless truth running through them all, that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of wisdom. Our most challenging experiences can become our most powerful teachers, and our darkest moments can become the forge in which our character is refined and our purpose is clarified. What did these 3 souls teach us? They taught us that pain is not our enemy, but our teacher. They showed us that failure is not the opposite of success, but its prerequisite. They revealed to us that what we think is the end of our story is often just the beginning of our real journey. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the most profound transformation comes not from avoiding difficult experiences, but from learning to work with them, to find meaning in them, and to use what we have learned to help others who are facing similar challenges. As you drift now into sleep, let these stories settle into your heart like seeds in fertile ground. Perhaps you will recognize in them faces from your own life, moments when you thought you had lost everything but discovered you had found something more valuable. Perhaps you will remember times when your own struggles became sources of strength, when your pain transformed into wisdom, when your darkness became the foundation for your light. And perhaps as you dream, you will imagine new ways to transform your own experiences, both the joyful ones and the difficult ones, into sources of power and purpose. You will remember that you too have the capacity to turn your wounds into wisdom, your struggles into strength, your challenges into opportunities to grow and to help others. Remember always that pain is not punishment, but preparation. It is not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced as a teacher that can show us depths of strength and wisdom we never knew we possessed. It is not the opposite of love, but often its most profound expression, teaching us to value what we have and to use our experiences to help heal others. Sleep well, my dear friend. Sleep deeply. And know that whatever you have faced in your life, whatever you're facing now, whatever challenges await you in your waking hours, you carry within you the power to transform pain into wisdom, struggle into strength, and darkness into light. Good night. And may your dreams be filled with the transformation that comes from learning that what breaks us open is exactly what sets us free.